Elijah McCoy, black engineer and inventor, born 1843, died 1929. Elijah McCoy made important contributions to the design of railroad locomotives and similar heavy industrial equipment by means of patented inventions that provided for automatic lubrication of moving parts. His initial work involved the steam locomotives that were in use following the Civil War, which were modest in size, in horsepower, and in their technical demands. But he kept pace with the progress of locomotive design, devising new lubricating systems that served the steam engines of the early 20th century. These were demanded indeed, for they operated at high temperatures and pressures. The date of McCoy's birth is not known. Various sources give it as March 27, 1843, May 2nd, 1843, and May 2nd, 1844. His parents, George McCoy and former Mildred Goines, were fugitive slaves who had escaped to Canada from Kentucky. George McCoy was a farmer. Canada at the time was part of the British Empire, which had abolished slavery by Act of Parliament in 1833. When the Canadian leader, Louis Riel, launched a rebellion in 1837, the British government used troops to defeat the rebels. George McCoy enlisted with the British force, and in return for his loyal service, he received 160 acres of farmland near Colchester, Ontario. Here, Elijah McCoy was born as one of 12 children. His father's ties to Britain proved useful as young McCoy pursued his education. As a boy, he was fascinated with tools and machines. At the age of 16, he traveled to Edinburgh, Scotland, to serve an apprenticeship in mechanical engineering. Scotland already was a center for shipbuilding and heavy industry, whereas Canada was largely rural. He therefore received opportunities for education and training that were unavailable at home. In Edinburgh, McCoy won the credentials of a master mechanic and engineer. He then rejoined his family. Following the Civil War, which ended in 1865, the McCoys returned to the United States and settled near Ypsilanti, Michigan, outside of Detroit. Young McCoy sought work as an engineer, but met defeat due to racial prejudice. Nevertheless, he obtained a job as a fireman and oiler on the Michigan Central Railroad in 1870. This was a responsible position, for service as a fireman was a customary prelude to promotion to the post of locomotive driver, which was prestigious indeed. But work as a fireman was a far cry from engineering, and it demanded much manual toil. As a fireman, McCoy had to shovel coal into the firebox of his locomotive at the rate of 2 tons per hour. He also had to walk around the locomotive and lubricate its moving parts using an oil can during frequent stops, while it took on water. Locomotives were heavy and subjected their moving parts to considerable wear. Lubrication was essential, or these parts, many of which were costly, would require frequent replacement. The railroad industry therefore held a strong interest in automatic lubrication, which was already being applied to railroad axles. These axles carried the full weight of locomotives and railroad cars, and were particularly subject to wear. But engineers had arranged for them to rotate within oil-filled chambers. The rotation of the axle carried oil into its bearing, and the oil bearing allowed the axle to turn freely while reducing wear to a minimum. But the direct use of oil-filled chambers did not apply to a locomotive's steam engine, which provided its power. Many parts of this engine operated under the pressure of steam, which acted to push oil away from the moving parts. This made it necessary to stop the engine when oiling it, but McCoy saw that he could keep the engine running by using steam pressure to pump the oil where it was needed. Working within a home-built machine shop in Ypsilanti, he devised an invention that became known as the lubricating cup. It relied on a piston set within an oil-filled container. Steam pressure pushed on the piston and thereby drove the oil into channels that carried this oil to the engine's operating parts. He sought and received a United States patent for this device, number 129843. It was granted on June 23, 1872. McCoy took his invention to officials of the Michigan Central and received their support. Installed on operating locomotives, it provided lubrication that was more regular and even then could be achieved by the old method of using an oil can during intermittent stops. This gave the railroad a useful advantage, for its locomotives now lasted longer and needed less maintenance. Even before receiving his first patent, McCoy was working on improvements that would lead to other patents as well. In addition, his lubricating cup proved adaptable to other types of steam engines, which were used in factories and at sea. Versions of this cup became standard components of many types of heavy machinery, entering service on railways of the West, on Great Lakes steamships, and even transatlantic liners. McCoy left the Michigan Central in 1882 and moved to Detroit, where he proceeded to devote all his time to his new career as an inventor. He also worked as an industrial consultant, assisting the Detroit Lubricator Company and other firms. The technical demands of railroads soon provided him with further challenges. Amid the growth of industry and of passenger travel, railroad companies needed larger locomotives. James J. Hill, builder of the Great Northern Railroad, introduced monsters that were up to 4 times larger than their predecessors, along with large-capacity freight cars. But such locomotives burned coal in large amounts and brought a demand for new designs that could achieve very high horsepower while using less coal. The solution lay in the use of superheated steam with high temperature and pressure. Superheating boosted the engine's efficiency, allowing a locomotive to get more miles per ton of coal. It also brought new problems in lubrication. The author, Robert C. Hayden, in his book 8 Black American Inventors, quotes an article in the Engineer's Journal. Quote, "There is no denying the fact that our present experience in lubricating the cylinders of engines using superheated steam is anything but satisfactory. If the oil feed was made regular so the steam would distribute it over the bearing surface of cylinder, while the engine was working, these bearing surfaces will be better protected than is now otherwise possible." Unquote. Rather than use oil alone as a lubricant, designers preferred to mix the oil with powdered graphite, a form of carbon. Powdered graphite is soft and greasy, and easily withstands high temperatures. However, because it is a powder rather than a liquid, it can clog an engine. In April 1915, McCoy received U.S. patent number 1,136,689 for what he called a locomotive lubricator. Within his patent application, he claimed that this invention would permit the use of graphite, quote, "without danger of clogging," unquote. Hayden cites a letter from a railroad superintendent, quote, "We have found the McCoy graphite lubricator to be of considerable assistance in lubrication of locomotives equipped with superheaters. There is a decided advantage in better lubrication and reduction of wear in valves and piston rings, and as a well-lubricated engine is more economical in the use of fuel, there is unquestionably a saving in fuel," unquote. In reviewing the life of this inventor, writers and essayists often note that railroad purchasing agents commonly insisted on buying, quote, "the real McCoy," unquote. Other inventors were offering lubricators that competed with those of McCoy, but these agents would accept no substitutes. Many of these authors assert Many of these authors assert that the phrase, quote, real McCoy, unquote, passed out of the specialized world of railroad engineering and entered general usage, where it came to mean the genuine article. William and Mary Morris, in their Morris Dictionary of Word and Phrase Origins, disagree. They find the origin of this expression in the career of a welterweight boxing champion, Kid McCoy, who distinguished himself from imitators by billing himself as the real McCoy. He held the world championship in his weight class from 1890 to 1900, during years when McCoy lubricators were entering widespread use. The expression real McCoy, coming into general use amid the popularity of boxing, then could have taken on a specialized meaning among railroad men. But while McCoy's inventions made millions of dollars, little of this money reached his pockets. Lacking the capital with which to build his lubricators in large numbers, he sold many of his patent rights to well-heeled investors, receiving in return only the modest sums that allowed him to continue his work. He received at least 72 patents during his lifetime, most of which dealt with lubricating devices, but he retained ownership of only a few of them. In 1868, he married Anne Elizabeth Stewart. She died in 1872, at age 25. A year later, he remarried to Mary Eleanora Delaney. This marriage lasted half a century, but neither of his marriages produced children. In 1920, at age 77, he joined with investors and founded the Elijah McCoy Manufacturing Company in Detroit, serving as vice president. The firm manufactured and sold his graphite lubricators, including an advanced version that also lubricated a railroad train's air brakes. But soon afterward, he and his wife Mary had a traffic accident. Mary received injuries from which she never fully recovered, and which hastened her death. She died in 1923. For Elijah, the end now approached as well. He became very lonely and sad. His health deteriorated, and in 1928 he entered the Alois Infirmary in Alois, Michigan. Suffering from hypertension and from senile dementia, he died there on October 10, 1929. McCoy was venerated in Detroit long after his death. In 1975, the city celebrated Elijah McCoy Day, as officials placed an historic marker at the site of his home. The city also named a street for him, Elijah McCoy Drive. These posthumous honors were modest, but they came a century after his invention of the lubricating cup and showed that he had left an enduring legacy in his work. Citations are in the description.